Thank you, Hayley, and thank you to One for inviting me. I will say it's slightly overwhelming. This is only the second time in 2 years that I've actually spoken to real people on maths rather than sitting in my lounge and talking to my computer. So it's great to see so many smiling faces and a couple of familiar faces of people I've met in the past. So I look forward to catching up later and taking on the challenge from Joe to make sure I speak to lots of you who I don't know. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking through my career journey to date, and I guess some personal reflections on some areas around which may be relevant from a networking perspective, and reflections on the power of networks and their importance both in the current workplace but even more so into the future. So, as Hayley said, I'm currently the CEO at MOSL, which is the market operator for the water retail non-household market. But before that, I was at Thames Water for 24 years. So my background originally was as a microbiologist. Interestingly, I chose microbiology simply because biology was my best A-level. I wanted to go to Surrey because my mum wasn't very well when I was a teenager and they didn't do biology, so I did microbiology. I mention that because that is a bit of a theme throughout my career. You often get asked about whether you had a plan. Just to be absolutely clear, I had no plan. So I left university, started a PhD, absolutely hated it, very quickly realised that sitting in the laboratory doing science every day, I remember being reported to the supervisor because I spoke too much and I was annoying the other scientists. So I realised that wasn't for me and didn't know what I was going to do. So I literally walked into the office of the lecturer on my course, who I thought was quite a nice bloke, and said, "You got anything I can do? I sort of need some work experience." And I got involved with, at that point, I thought I was going to be a food microbiologist. And I got involved with a project with Oxfam and the DFID for international development, looking at building small-scale water treatment works for refugee situations. And I was working with a female engineer who's now was a very close friend of mine. She was a civil engineer, and effectively our task was, as two women, I would have been in my early 20s then, to design and build this package plant. We built it upside down, but we learned how to then take it apart and put it back together again. And that was really, I guess, what got me hooked on to water. I worked there for about a year, and then I was sitting there thinking, I really do need to earn some money at some point. And I overheard one of my lecturers on the phone talking to someone at Thames Water and apologising to them because the person who had was about to start their doctorate programme with them had some family problems, and he'd had to go back to Cameroon. And I jumped up and said, "I'll do it." He said, "Well, you don't know what it is." I was like, "I don't know, I just need a job." So that's how I started my career in Thames. So the first 4 years I did a doctorate in biofilms in water pipes, if anyone's interested. In the innovation team, I then moved into managing a small team of scientists, 5 men. I was probably 25 then. They were all over 50. They weren't particularly impressed by me being their line manager. And then I moved into wastewater operations. So I went from managing 3 to 5 scientists over that year to leading a team of 200 frontline wastewater treatment operatives. I then got pregnant with my first child. And again, the power of hindsight is amazing, and maybe that's what one of the powers of network is, and sharing these experiences, because it still makes me really angry to acknowledge that what happened next was I was told that I couldn't do an operational job as a young mum. And for no other reason other than I lived in Guildford and my job was in Swindon, I accepted that. And I'm, looking back, I wouldn't accept that now because the logic was completely flawed. So I basically didn't have a job. I came back and my director didn't know what to do with me, and I was filling out spreadsheets. I was absolutely bored, stupid. So I then started chasing pregnant women. I saw this woman at the, it was a very important part of my career. I saw this woman standing at a vending machine who I vaguely knew, and she was very heavily pregnant, and said, "Who's covering your maternity leave?" And she said, "Well, they haven't sorted it." "Oh, I'll do it." It's like, you don't know what what I do. I was like, but it must be better than these spreadsheets. So I then did 4 short-term secondments. I covered 4 people's maternity leave, and I would genuinely recommend that for people early on in their careers, because it meant I did 4. At that point, maternity leave sounds really bad when I think about it now, it was 7 months, so I had 7 months off for both of mine. But it meant I covered 4 completely different parts of the business for a short period of time. I implemented work management systems, I worked in best operating practice, things which are completely new and different. I then went off and had my second child, and when I came back, I was offered my absolute dream job. It was head of wastewater science. It was my dream job at the time. So it was managing all the wastewater scientists from across Thames Water. But the challenge was it was a full-time role. And I was told it was sort of full-time or nothing. I'd gone back 3 days a week after my daughter was born, and I didn't want to work full-time. I was happy to do 4 days. And I guess that's the first time I had some advice from another woman in the workplace, and it was actually our HR director who was very pregnant, and the first thing she said to me was, if you ever tell anyone we've had this conversation, I'll deny it. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And she basically said, what part of the job, if you do it in 4 days, because they'd agreed to do, she said, what part of the job won't you do? What's the 5th you won't do? Because if they can't tell you that, then ask for 5 days in 4. And I'm going to hold that thought for later, because that's something that spurred me on later on in my career. So I managed to get that agreement. I did that for a while. I then moved into asset management, first wastewater, then managed all of asset management. Then in 2011, I was asked by my then director to move into strategy and regulation and lead a price review. And my response was, would it be a career limiting move if I said no? That sounds really awful, sounds really boring. At that point, I had a team of about 970 people, and I was being asked to move into a role where there were 2 people, both of them were on short-term contracts, and both of them were underperforming. And I said, don't be so blooming stupid, the CEO's asked you to do it, just go and do it. And also I didn't get on with the director at all. We'd had a few clashes, so I was like, it's just a terrible move. But again, for me, that was one of those moments in my career, which was probably one of the best career moves I made, because it taught me that having a big team, and I don't know, I mean, all of you, I assume, work in utilities in one area or another, but certainly within Thames Water, and I see a few ex-colleagues around the room, it was all about how many people you were managing. So in my head at that point, this was a massive step backwards, because I was managing this massive team. I had power, I had control, I had a massive budget, and then I was going into the corporate office to do something boring about regulation. But it's probably the best move I made in my career, because what it taught me was having the ability to influence isn't just about managing large teams. And I learned a lot about how the organisation, and actually one of my first emotions in that role was pure embarrassment that I'd come from a role where I was managing budgets of about £200 million worth of capital investment. And I remember sitting in one of my first meetings, and all my colleagues were talking about whether we were going to get a big whack or a small whack, and I had no idea what you're talking. It's the weighted average cost of capital, I found out. And I realised I had no idea where the money came from. If you'd have asked me where a water company got their money, I sort of vaguely thought Ofwat gave it to them, which clearly isn't the case. And so for me, that change was opening myself up, making myself very vulnerable. I was an expert in my area, and suddenly I was the least qualified person in the room. I had no idea what anybody was talking about. So I did that for a price control. Then in 2014, I was asked by our then CEO if I wanted to go on a course called the Pipeline course, which is for senior leaders, generally women, it's all women, but generally women who are at the executive level or trying to get into the executive level. And again, my first response was, well, no, I'm all right. I've always worked in a male-dominated environment, and I'm going to say this with embarrassment. I genuinely, up until then, I didn't do women's networks. I just thought, well, I'm sort of fine. I've done all right in this male environment. What do? Do you all talk about handbags and shoes? It wasn't something appealed, and I'm very embarrassed. I'm probably blushing now just to think about that, because I just didn't get it. And I sort of reluctantly went along. And again, it's probably one of the turning points of my career, is sitting in a room with other women and realising the power of sharing stories, of being able to be completely myself, not try and be one of the blokes. And I was trying to behave in a way that fitted in with the culture that Thames Water had. And so I would, again, sit there, bang the table a bit. I swore a lot. I didn't tend to wear dresses because I'd had an experience early on in my career. I think, I was very, very junior, and the first time I spoke to the executive team, and I sat down in the room, and I was there talking about codiforms in North London, and the senior director sat next to me. I sat down, he put his hand on my knee. And you know, he really has got his hand on my knee, and he's not just got his hand on my knee, he's stroking my knee. So I sort of just sat there, and I just powered it through, and but when I went back to my boss the next day and told him what had happened, his response was, "You do wear quite short skirts, Sarah." So I changed the way I dressed, because I was like, well, you know, I don't want that to happen again, and if it's because my skirt's a bit short. So I guess what I then learned in doing that course was the power of sharing experiences, being really honest. I remember the first time talking to another working mum about how guilty I felt sometimes about leaving my children when I went to work. How I would sometimes, if there was an event after school, leave my jacket on the back of my chair so people thought I was in a meeting, when actually I was racing home hoping that I wasn't going to miss the 1 second of my child on stage singing something, and just having that ability to share experiences. And I guess the other sort of main point to pull out from my career journey is going back to that never having a plan. All of the promotions, all of the opportunities I've had in my career were all through somebody thinking of me, and that was primarily because the other thing I did during all of those jobs was get involved in broader corporate things. So I was involved in ODs, in values definitions, in transformation plans. Thames used to get bought quite a lot by different shareholders. I was involved with the due diligence processes. So those changes, which was great when I was in Thames, it was a bit of a shock after 24 years to have to go into an interview, because I'd never had an interview. In fact, I didn't even have an interview when I joined Thames. So coming out the other end of that was a bit scary. But I guess the other final point, so just bringing it right up to date, I then joined the executive team in Thames as Managing Director of Water, so managing the water assets, both above ground and the water networks in 2016. I think that there were some interesting challenges during that 2-year period. I think some ex-Thames colleagues in the room, I probably won't go into any details. But it was clear it was the time for me to move on to the next part of my journey, and moved up. At that point, I moved into the role of CEO of MOSL. And I guess the final sort of sharing from that career journey would be, you can learn as much from poor leaders as you can from good leaders. So I learned a lot about how not to be a CEO over those 2 years, and that probably taught me more about how to go in and be a CEO, to be a good CEO, than seeing good CEOs in the past. So that I guess is my journey. I'm happy to pick up any questions at the end, but I thought I would just share some thoughts now on the sort of how I reflect on that into the future of the workplace, and something which I'm hugely passionate about, which is the role of having a diverse workforce. So I was thinking, I was asked to do this, what is my sort of ideal in terms of the future workforce? If I can take all that experience, say, what does great look like? And for me, it's about every single human being who comes into work being able to be their best self every day. And that will be different for everybody. And that means ensuring that workplaces are inclusive, and every individual within that workplace can make a positive contribution. And that's important for lots of reasons. There's lots of moral reasons why that's the right thing to do, But there's very clear evidence that diverse workforces make better decisions. And interestingly, diverse companies with diverse workforces, particularly at a decision-making level, make more money. So there's a very practical business reason for having an inclusive workplace, as well as just because it's the right thing to do. And that's something that I have really focused on in my role as CEO of MOSL. And that's been a big transition. I've gone from leading a team of 2,000 people. Again, we're a total of 76 in MOSL. But the really cool thing about it is you can influence culture really quickly when you have that smaller team. And for me, part of that inclusive culture is enabling people and supporting that safe working environment where people can call out behaviours and explain things that make them feel uncomfortable. You know, there's some obvious things like having a director's hand on your knee is not a great thing and something to call out, but there are lots of other things which will be different for everybody that they're uncomfortable with, and that doesn't necessarily mean changing everything. It's about having an environment where people can just openly say why things make them feel uncomfortable. So just to sort of look at the water sector or the utility sector specifically, if you look across the energy and utility sector, about 28% of employees are female. It's slightly less if you look just at water. But only 4% of employees are not white. One of the things we've managed to achieve in MOSL over the last 2.5 years is a workforce where we are about 50-50 on gender. We actually have a female-dominated board. 5 of us out of 8 are women, and 36% of our colleagues are not white. And although to a certain extent that happened organically, we haven't set any targets, we haven't deliberately recruited people with a set agenda. It's equally not an accident, because when you have a genuinely inclusive workforce and you have that diversity of thinking within an organisation and you are open and welcome everybody in on an equal footing, that you attract people who are different. You don't just attract people who, with all due respect to the guys at the end, are white middle-class, middle-aged men. You get some different people coming in. And for me, it's really important through networks like this that we have one and other networks, whether they're all women or broader networks, that we can support a future that is different to the past that I've described in some ways. One of the things, for example, that I'm involved with is working with a university technical college in East London. So it's a STEM college, focuses in ages 14 to 18. Over the past 5 years since they opened, they've seen a steady decline in the number of girls that they attract. And I've been working with them about, trying to explore why that is. And actually, for a lot of the girls, it's because they are very aspirational. It's a very deprived area of East London, but it's a very high academic standard. But they're very narrow in their thinking about what a good career, what can a woman do in the workplace. So they come in and they're thinking about being a doctor, about being a lawyer, about being an accountant. And actually, one of the things that we've been working on in MOSL is exposing those girls to a wide range of women from different backgrounds, just sharing their career stories. And a number of the women that I've introduced to those girls are now mentoring them, particularly the 17-year-olds. But that's about recognising that there are lots of different careers you can do, and you don't just have to think about those traditional ones. So I guess moving on, it's really important that we learn from each other and work together to bring about change. It's really important that we don't become exclusive and exclude men from a conversation about women. It's really important that if we're going to change, if we're going to get equal pay, if we're going to change paternity and maternity policies, that men are part of that debate. In the same way as you can't end racism without white people standing up for equality, without that allyship. You have to have everybody in that discussion. So returning to my second maternity leave, after my conversation with my HR director, I approached my male director and said, you know, I'm really interested in the job, but I really want to, I'm only willing to do 4 days a week, but I want to be paid for 5 days a week. And my personal view is if I am consistently exceeding expectations in my performance review, you shouldn't be asking me how many hours I'm working. We'll only have that conversation if I'm not. I was hardly breathing by the time I left the room. Bloody hell. And he said yes. And well, bloody hell, I had all this other script to come behind it. And he's like, yeah. But the reason he said yes was because his daughter, who bizarrely was born on exactly the same day as me, and her name's Lucy, which is the name of my daughter, was working for Vodafone at the time, and she'd just gone back from maternity leave and was having a really, really awful time. So the reason he said yes to me wasn't because it was Thames's policy, it was because he had a personal experience, and his view was, I cannot look my daughter in the eye when I go home today if I said no to you. He didn't tell me that till years afterwards. I just walked out going, okay, I'm just going to go now, while he said yes. And for me, that's what's wrong. It can't be about just finding a sympathetic boss. That worked for me at that moment in time, and that was brilliant for me personally. But it isn't, it has to be about having clear policies that retain women in the workplace. And if you look at, a scientist by heart, if you look at what the research says about making a difference for retaining women in the workplace, and if you look at the tech sector, whilst you have a very equal gender balance at entry level, you have a very quick fall off, and if you get to 35 in tech, you're doing really, really well, because it's actually not that easy to progress. But there are 4 key practices that tend to retain women in the workplace. The first, again, by personal experience, is strong maternity and paternity policies, but encouraging not just women but men to take up paternity leave, and to have those policies that ensure that you can have equity and equality in childcare, and really importantly, not just in childcare but in other caring responsibilities. For a lot of women, you get to the point where I am now, where I've got my daughter's now 20 and at university, my son's 18, about to head off to university in September, and now I've got ageing parent-in-laws who need some support, and so often it's women who will step into those caring responsibilities towards once your children have moved on. And it's important that senior managers lead by example, and again ensuring that men in senior positions are seen to be carers where that's appropriate. Stating the obvious, it's important you see people like you, so having female role models who are at the top of the company, and women can see, actually, I can get there. I can see a route that includes me on that journey. And I think, whilst I said we haven't set internal targets in MOSL, I think actually at executive and board level it is important that you're open and set targets, and that you actually actively think about getting a diverse team. The third one is women-specific support programmes. So the importance of having support programmes where including opportunities like this, but also the importance of having mentor programmes, sponsorship, and resource networks, and giving women the opportunity to have those open and honest conversations. And then finally, providing networking opportunities that are inclusive. And again, if you're thinking about having caring responsibilities, it's important that networking events, as much as it's lovely to see everyone here this evening, that networking events for women are not just at the end of the working day, but they are at lunchtime, they're within the working day, and it's seen as important. It's not seen as skiving off, it's actually part of your personal development and part of your career development. And sessions such as this are brilliant for supporting women for a career in utilities, which remains, for now, a very male-dominated environment still. I guess 2 very final thoughts. Something that I've recognised, and may be important for here today, and the point that Joe made is, it's easy to ignore actually what it still feels like. If you're getting a bit more confident at this, one of the things I do very actively now is if I'm in an environment such as this and I see a woman enter a room on her own, even if it's an all women event, but more so the sorts of things I usually go to which are very male dominated, just making the effort to go over and say hi and introduce yourself, because we can all, I suspect everyone in this room has walked into a room and just thought, I just really want to go home now. So those, for me, it's those sharing those really practical tips about how do you make sure that you bring people into the debate. And then finally, going back to the theme of this evening, I genuinely see the future as one where everyone, regardless of their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, can be their best self at work, and that we all support each other to develop and to learn and grow in the workplace. Thank you.